The cops had their guns pointed at my 16-year-old son when he was putting flowers on his brother's grave. 1 minute Nathan was kneeling, his trembling hand on the flag-covered box in our backyard. The next a voice shouted, "Get on the ground!" And half a dozen officers burst in like they were on a raid. All because our neighbor Susan called in a suspicious youth with a shovel and weapon doing something cultish on HOA property. She had no idea this wasn't some backyard ceremony. It was the burial of my eldest son, a decorated veteran who died overseas. And she didn't know the woman fighting to hold back tears by the roses, moving calmly toward the officers, was the United States Attorney General. That was when Susan made her last deadly mistake. It started 2 weeks before, when I chose to bury my son James at home. We own 5 acres land my family has owned for generations, before the HOA swooped up the neighboring lots to create their homogeneous suburb. Our land was legally a private cemetery, an old Southern tradition. Susan either didn't understand or disregarded. James's dying wish was easy, to be buried under the oak tree. He ascended as a child with his little brother placing the initial flowers. So we buried him quietly, privately, with respect. To Susan, however, our mourning conflicted with her vision of neighborhood charm. That gray morning, the sky soft and heavy, Nathan wore James's old scout jacket, sleeves too long, heart too full. It was just family, a chaplain, a folded flag, and a low honor song from a speaker. Nathan stepped up with wildflowers and James's dog tags, knelt, whispered something, and kissed the wooden urn. Then Susan's shriek cut through. "What's going on here?" She stood at her pristine lawn's edge, arms crossed, eyebrows sky high. "You can't bury people wherever you want. This is HOA land." I told her again that it was our land, federally registered, exempt from HOA regulations. She didn't listen. Susan never did. She saw my grieving son and determined he threatened her property value. 15 minutes later, as we stood silently around James's grave, flashing lights materialized. Patrol cars swarmed the driveway like we were armed fugitives. My stomach fell when I watched officers draw their belts and heard the snap on the pavement. Hands where I can see them. Nathan stood rigid, eyes open with fear, hands suspended. I moved forward calm in spite of every instinct yelling, "I'm the nation's best law enforcement officer." But at that moment, I was a mom witnessing her only living child treated like a criminal. I flashed my badge, the one I've carried since I took the oath. "I'm Elizabeth Carter, United States Attorney General. Stand down." The senior officer paled as if he'd walked into a storm wearing sandals. Susan, taping from her driveway, sneered as if she'd spotted a parking infraction. When the officers hesitated, she waved, "I'll be pressing charges." That boy threatened me with a stick. The stick was a folded flagpole. What ensued was stilted apologies, nervous fidgeting, and Susan shouting, "This woman's lying. That badge is fake. Anyone can buy one online." An officer whispered to his companion, probably checking on my identity. Within 30 seconds, the scene turned on its head. The officers stepped back. Nathan came up shaking, and Susan, noticing the change, chirped, "I was just keeping the neighborhood in line. There are rules." "Yes, there are," I said, "and as the chief of enforcing federal law, I'll use everybody." That afternoon, after getting Nathan settled inside, I took a stroll down our property line with a camera. Susan had placed 2 surveillance cameras pointed at our yard, a blatant privacy infringement. I recorded them, along with her aggressive sign, "HOA governed area trespassers." Discover she'd already issued a cease and desist letter, alleging our burial violated community peace standards. What she didn't realize was her HOA was a cesspool of illicit finances I disregarded up to now. Grief is a heavy burden, but injustice ignites a flame, and Susan had just lit the match. The following day, I made a discreet call, not a public favor, just a quiet request for a DOJ investigator to peek into the HOA's books and charter. I expected petty abuses and fines. I didn't expect wire fraud, elder abuse, and a catalog of violations. The HOA wasn't just mismanaged, it was Susan's private thief, and she just seen Ed, the U.S. government. The morning after the burial fiasco, the neighborhood hushed as if it sensed a reckoning. Susan's lawn ornaments, usually regimented, were askew. There was a flamingo that collapsed like it fainted in the drama. Enjoying coffee on my veranda, I sat and watched as neighbors ran by, avoiding contact. Word had raced not so much about the 911 call, but who I. Situation reversed. The officer stepped back. Nathan sat up shaking, and Susan, feeling the change, chirped, "I was just keeping the neighborhood safe. There are rules." "Yes, there are," I replied. "And as the chief enforcer of federal law, I'll use everyone." That afternoon, after settling Nathan inside, I walked our property line with a camera. Susan had placed 2 surveillance cameras pointed at our yard, a blatant privacy offense. I chronicled them along with her angry sign HOA governed area. Trespassers discover she'd already faxed a cease and desist letter, asserting our burial violated neighborhood peace standards. What she had no idea was her HOA was a cesspit of dirty money I'd long ignored previously. Grief is an onerous burden, but injustice ignites a fire, and Susan had just lit the match. The following day, I made a quiet call, not a favor to the public, just a quiet request for an investigator from DOJ to take a look at the HOA's books and charter. I figured on petty abuse and fines. I did not figure wire fraud, elder abuse, and a list of offenses. The HOA wasn't mismanaged. It was Susan's own personal thief, and she just Ed the U.S. government. The morning after the burial disaster, the neighborhood fell silent, as if it felt a reckoning. Susan's lawn decoration, which normally regimented where Askew a flamingo, lay toppled like it fainted from the drama. Sipping coffee on my porch, I watched neighbors hurry by, avoiding eye contact. Word had spread not just about Susan's 911 call, but who I was. A few waved weakly, others hid behind bushes. I didn't blame them. They'd lived under Susan's thumb, and now that thumb might snap. Susan doubled down, posting on the HOA forum that I'd faked my position to bully hardworking board members, and that Nathan had terrorized the block with military theatrics, blurry photos of him with the flag bore captions like "suspicious youth in camo, armed and dangerous." Someone said, "Isn't that the Attorney General's son?" She answered, "Not confirmed. Could be crisis actors." That's when I called David, a fastidious DOJ investigator who resembled a math teacher but could unravel empires with a spreadsheet. "Pineview Estates, HOA," I said. "Begin with finances, then dig, no push." And again ordered us to leave. "Hurry up and don't rush." He nodded and disappeared into his files. Meanwhile, Susan called an emergency HOA meeting, handing out flyers and a visor and windbreaker like a campaigner. Community safety and standards under attack. They read when Nathan and I arrived, heads turned like we'd stormed in. Susan, holding a mic, stammered but continued. "We need to discuss property abuse for unapproved events. An unauthorized funeral last week included flags, guns, and minors in distress." I raised my hand. "Our lands, exempt on file since 1979. She grinned. "Anyone can get something filed, doesn't make it legal." Nathan pulled open a folder and read, "State exemption for family cemeteries. Notarized deed precedes the HOA by 20 years. Federal protections for military burials." The room quieted. Someone breathed. "Oh, wow," Susan spun. "It's about noise flags lowered without permission and emotional impact. So grief has to have a schedule?" I asked, rattled. She called a vote, pre-approval for ceremonies, burials, memorials, flags, parties over. For 2 hands rose hers and a crony's. A voice piped up. We didn't know we could ignore her. Laughter broke the tension. Later, David called. "You'll want to see this." His files revealed thousands in unexplained HOA transfers, feeding fake landscaping payments, wires to Susan's PayPal for community enrichment. Worse, she'd contracted a company to install hidden cameras in birdhouses and mailboxes, streaming video to her laptop, spying on neighbors, even children. It wasn't just nosiness, it was criminal. I allowed the rope tighten. Susan went undercover in sunglasses and a cap, while neighbors traded tales of her discoveries. One for a disruptive shadow from an umbrella, another for out-of-control tail wagging. Nathan cared for James's grave, installing flowers and constructing a bench, his hands less shaky. Susan uncoiled, writing about government spies, and taking James's flag was bothering wildlife. She discovered a dead soldier evidence. She lost it. Her slide was quick. She filled mailboxes with ridiculous discoveries: $1.75 for reflective wind chimes, another for laughter after 9 p.m., Neighbors while David discovered covert mics in trail stones and cameras in bird feeders saved on Susan's encrypted hard drives. She'd simulated infractions, such as pulling out trash cans. During holidays for pictures, I met police chief who she kills us with complaints. Fence fights, holiday lighting. I gave him a folder. Operation Sparrow, he grumbled. She's done. Susan issued a cease and desist to DOJ, labeling it harassment and highlighting sovereign community. David obtained a warrant. I organized a public HOA meeting, estimating Susan's fraudulent transfers video, bogus citations. Neighbors blew their tops, recounting stories of her tyranny, fines for excessive hair, or a clashing red vehicle. That evening, agents confiscated her equipment, charges hung in the air. Wire fraud, privacy violations, elder abuse. After she took advantage of an elderly neighbor's money, Susan sued me for emotional distress. In court, her attorney Gary, a sovereign strategist, stumbled around corporate America, her lawsuit typos, and all alleged I terrorized her. The judge, unimpressed, let Nathan testify. He talked about losing James the police. The humiliation, Susan objected, manipulative. But the judge snapped, he's burying his brother. You're whining about mailboxes. Susan ranted about anti-HOA operatives, attempted submitting a blog as evidence, and tore removed and fined. Her suit was dismissed with sanctions. That afternoon, she was indicted wire fraud surveillance harassment. The HOA dissolved its office, vacant headlines blared. Suburban tyrant indicted. Susan was arrested, sneaking out with suitcases and a Queen of Order mug. Nathan and I sat by James's tree, the wind whispering peace. She thought she owned us, he said. I nodded. We never belonged to her. Months later, we turned the HOA office into James's haven, a memorial garden. At its dedication, neighbors shredded old notices. Kids chalked freedom lives here. Susan, sentenced to 6 years, sent a note. Maybe I mistook control for safety. I filed it under closure. The neighborhood healed, yellow houses, barking dogs. Barbecues, Nathan addressed veterans groups, a quiet light. At dusk by James's tree, I knew we'd won. Not justice, but our peace, our dignity in a world that viewed Susan for the threat she was. Love and truth shattered her empire.